Well, hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Dave McCormick, Vice President of Marketing for Alpha Software, and I'm very pleased to present David Cates, owner of Adjustable Software. David is a Microsoft Access expert and a rather impressive Alpha Anywhere developer. And today he'll be tackling a topic that I know is of interest to many of you, and that is how to extend your legacy Access desktop database applications to the web and to mobile devices.
Welcome, everyone. So good afternoon. We're going to have a look today at Alpha Anywhere as it pertains to Microsoft Access. There are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences, and I know that by going through some of these items, it'll hope to help you step into Alpha Anywhere a little bit better. What we'll do first is we'll have a look at the programming environment, the interface. In Access, we're dealing with forms. In Alpha, we're dealing with grids and UX components mainly, and I'm going to go through each one of these individually. Reports, well, they're always reports. Macros in Access are handled by, and this is going to sound a little funny, by Action JavaScript, which is a preset list and group of JavaScript methods and actions that Alpha's put together. And you can actually call them individually, or you can call them by JavaScript Actions. And I'll show you that in a few minutes. But generally, a JavaScript action runs an action JavaScript action. It sounds great. And it'll make sense in a few minutes, I hope. And you can run multiple action JavaScript actions. You can run them either asynchronously or synchronously. And JavaScript by its nature is asynchronous, but what Alpha's been able to do is to put in something called a run this, then that sort of process so that we do get a synchronous nature out of JavaScript, which is really nice. Tab controls, which are a big part of Access. There's a tab control, of course, available in the grid and the UX component. There's a tab UI interface as well, and that's what you're looking at here. So I've got a number of buttons that I can define how they look. They can be hyperlinks, they can be buttons, and as you click, the items pop up on the screen. Auto exec is a big thing. The closest thing I could say for that, of course, there are a number of really great events that take place as grid or UX component is firing off, before everything's rendered, after everything's rendered, before the grid is initialized, after it's initialized, that sort of thing. In terms of Alpha and the auto exec, Alpha's created something called an app launcher component, which is a component all by itself. And what that allows you to do is use a login component and be able to test the environment that you're in. So if you're in a browser or you're in a tablet, then you can specify exactly which items you want to load and how you want to load them. So I think what we'll do first is, what's the next item? Access security. Well, let's go through that a little bit. Access security in its current format is a little sad. Microsoft decided to remove a lot of stuff that was in there. In the MDB format, user and group security is there, but they've removed it from the current ACCDB format. With Alpha, you get a full user and group security, a great interface, and there are a number of options in there. A lovely login component, very simple, works beautifully. Of course, the app launcher component also supports its own login. So if you have security set, and you don't have to have security set, of course, you can turn it on. But if you do have a login component, then the app launcher will support that login component. And UX components, which can run on the web or in a mobile environment, can run with its own integrated login component, which is really nice as well. Alpha Access execution. Access, a runtime, of course, runs on a hosting company that supports Access. Alpha runs on its own server, the Windows application server. So you need a separate license for that. You can run it self-hosted if you need to, or you can run with a hosting company. For example, ZeroHost has done a lot of work with Alpha systems, and they're experts and have amazing support. And these systems are usually hosted within VPS. And let's go on to Alpha grids and UX access forms. What I think I'll do first, though, is we'll get into Alpha. I'm going to shut down the current database I have. And I just want to take you through this so it looks somewhat familiar when you get into it yourself. I'm going to go and create a new empty workspace. Now, with Access, it's all encapsulated into one file, the ACCDB file or the MDB file. Everything lives in there. Not so much with Alpha, although a number of items are held within files. So here, when we create a new workspace, we have a choice to make. We can use web, mobile, or desktop. I'm going to do web and mobile. So I'm going to go ahead and create this new empty workspace. It'll pop into my drive. I'm going to select my data drive, a new folder. So I'm just going to type new workspace and hit enter there. And so I'm going to get in here, and I'm going to call my new database. And I'm going to save that. And Alpha pops up and shows me an empty environment, and it groups its information by A5W pages, which is kind of the same thing as an HTML page, but runs XBasic code. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Pure HTML pages, CSS style sheets, which you can create or use the ones that are provided by Alpha within your systems. JavaScript files, these can be your own files or libraries that you download from various services that are provided in the web world. Images that you may want to have within your database, web components, which we'll talk about in a moment, reports, of course, and then you can get an all files process going, so you can see everything. So it's kind of similar to Access in terms of dividing its information up. And I think what we'll do is we'll just shut that down. And what we'll do, I think I'll go to the drive. And it was my new workspace, and this is what it looks like. So we've got a number of basic files that are set up, and these files house the general environment and the data that are going in. Web projects, default web project. This is the area that all your information is going to go into. So I'll just show you the current database I'm going to be working with, which is not that one, Northwinds. There we go. So these are, once again, the files that I'm going to be working with. These house a lot of the information and settings for Alpha, web projects, default web projects. And these are all my HTML files. These are a number of images that I have put into the database. These are my grids and my UX components, my reports. You can see each one is a separate file. It makes it really easy for backing up, for exchanging components with individuals, for moving components around. It's extremely easy. So as soon as I move a new component in here, if I copy it from somewhere else, it shows up in my environment. I'm just going to shut that down, and I'm going to open up my database. So let's go back to what we're dealing with here. Alpha grids and UX components and access forms. Access forms are data bound and unbound, of course. Alpha grids are data bound. They'll always be bound to a table, and they're used more in a web environment, so a browser environment, not as opposed to a mobile environment. Although grids can be used in a mobile environment, the UX component has been specifically designed to handle mobile. Although UX component lives very, very nicely in a web atmosphere as well, but it is designed to take advantage of mobile devices. And the UX component can be data bound, and it can be unbound as well. Even though it's unbound, you can still get at data and move with data quite easily. So what I think I'll do is pop in here now and show you some of this stuff. I'm going to be working in the Alpha environment. I'm not going to be running anything by buttons or anything like that. So here we are in a grid builder. I've specified when I started this grid that it's going to be a tabular grid, so one line of information per row. You could have a form if you want to, or I'll show you what that looks like, or a stacked column, which is kind of interesting. The grid can be read-only or updatable. It can have a search part in it, and it can have a detail view as well. And I'm just going to send it back to a tabular view. As soon as you pick these options, this information pops in here. If I were to take that out, my information for my search disappears or pops back in. And all these are defined exactly as you want them to be. It's a very top-down approach. Alpha's made it really easy. So you pick your component type, you go directly to data source, and you choose whether you want it to be DBF tables or SQL-based tables. And query, select a data file. Now, data strings, connection strings are really interesting. In Access, you connect to your SQL back. Let's stay with the SQL backend by defining that backend, and then that information is held within each link on every table. You can programmatically get at that stuff in Access, and it's not too hard to get at. But things work here a little bit differently, and what I'm going to do is take you through a process where we actually define an alpha string. I've got a Northwinds. This is my string that defines a connection to the Northwinds MDB file, but I've copied the tables up into MySQL, and that's what we're looking at here. I'm just going to build this. So we define the connection type. This connection string is built as we go along. We define the host name, the port, root, password, the database that we're looking at, and any other features that we want. We have a connection test. We have a test connection again here if we want to use it. So once that's built, then I can go back into my grid and actually choose the connection string. Once I choose a connection string here, Alpha knows which database I'm dealing with because I've told it, and now I can go ahead and select any of the tables from that database. I can look at tables or views, linked tables, anything else that I need to do. I choose a table. Alpha always pops in an alias, which is good. You don't have to worry about that. I can define arguments and filters and an order. The primary key is usually set, but I always check that anyway just to make sure it is. So that looks good. And once that happens, then Alpha fills in all the available fields for me. Plus it puts in a couple of extras, a row number and a logical row number. And these are 1-based or 0-based. And these are all my available fields, but I can choose which fields I want to actually show. In this particular case, since I'll go back here, since I have a detail view part listed, which means I'm going to be running with the main part of the record and then detail for that record itself. So I'm not going to show everything within the grid. I will show everything within the grid, but not on the very first line, and you'll see that in a moment. So I'm going to pick customer ID, company name, and a contact name, and we have just a ton of properties that we're able to set. There are so many properties in here at times that there's a search properties that you can get at, which is really handy because it's tough going through a long list, but that makes it really, really easy. Control types can be a number of different things. In this particular case, it's going to be a label because we're not going to be doing anything with this data. We're just going to be showing it. To do with access, there are a number of other similarities, the events that we're dealing with on click, on double click, key presses, on blurs, and these will grow and shrink depending on where you are and what you're dealing with. So let's just show this the way it looks right now. I've defined a number of buttons. The buttons all each have on click, on double click as well. And I'll show you the difference as well when we get into it between a number of new events that have been put in for mobile devices. But let's just look at the way this looks now. What Alpha's done is they've built in a live preview and a working preview so that we can actually see what we're doing as we're building. Now I've asked my grid to put in a really nice search option here, and I've tied it to the customer ID so that I can click on any button. And it's my choice in this particular type of search whether I want to include numbers or not, or the all button or not. This has been defined. I'm just going to jump back and forth here in this search part here, where I define which fields I want to include in the search and what the properties of the search are. And I've asked for the search to be a hyperlink, so I can click the search here. And you can define search in a number of different ways as well. In this case, I've said I want search as such, click search, and I'll get everything that starts with A. and I can clear the search criteria. And you can even define this as a hyperlink or a button. There are a number of different options here. So I've set this up once again. We're going to pop back in here as having a detail view, which means that I'm going to see this information here. I'm going to see these fields, but when I do something, I'm going to see the balance of the fields in this record. Let's pop back into live view again. And I've asked that the customer ID be a hyperlink field so that when I click on it, my balance of the information pop in. This is all editable now, of course. I could include these fields as well if I wanted to. You can include anything in here, so it's up to you what you want to do with this. New records, delete records. I can make changes here. Nothing that will show up. And as I click on new records, you see a number of things change. And I can close that back up again. So that's basically the grid. It's in a grid format. Looks great. Let me pop back here. And this, once again, this is a data-bound grid. We walk through that. And what we'll do now is I think we'll stay with the grid, and we'll pop into calling code, since that's a big part of this. I'm going to go back to design mode, and I'm going to go back to the fields that I defined. Now these fields here, these are obviously not part of my database, and they come in here. I can add column spacers, row spacers. I can merge cells together. So in other words, if I wanted company name and contact name together, I could put them together in there. So they'll show up as kind of one field. I can add a button, hyperlink. I can add static text into the grid if I want to, images, and I can link other grids into this as well. Now you can link grids and you can link UX components. And in the UX component, you can link in grids as well. So in my on-click event, I've got something called, I'm working with Action JavaScript here. So this is more like the macro environment that Access has to offer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new action, and I'm going to walk you through what I did to get to this. We're going to open up a grid component, and I think what I'll do is let me just show you what that looks like first. So here we are in orders. So these are my customer orders that I have defined for this particular customer. These are all the orders, and I can go to order details, and these are the order details for that specific order. I can close this down, go to order details for the next order, close this down, go to another, order details. As you can see, the information flows through really nicely. So now let's go back into design mode. The on-click event. I'm going to add a new action, and these are my action JavaScript entries. Here's where I can select an action. This is one of the great things about Alpha, because no matter where you are, there's going to be a lot of information about what you're working with at the time, and or how to get to it easily, and or if there's a big long list and you don't remember what's going on, because I know I never do, you can filter the list. So I can look for anything to do with grid components, which is really nice. So in this particular case, I want to look at a grid component. What I can do is reduce the list to something a bit more specific. I want anything to do with emails, files, HTML containers, Cordova, PhoneGap, pop-up messages, all actions. But in this case, I'm going to do something with a grid. So I'm going to open up a grid component. And this is more like a macro in Access, but it's like a macro on steroids, because there's a lot of information here and there's a lot of variability. And again, we just walk you through the entire process, and there's always a really good explanation of what's going on. Plus, quite often, a base filter. Always look for something like this going on. It gives you an explanation of what the base filter is as opposed to what a user filter is. So there's a lot of help built right into the system. And I'd say most of the time, this is going to be enough to get you through to do whatever you want to do. If there are various options, this information down here will always tell you what the options mean, and usually as opposed to each other as well, which is really nice. So in this particular case, I'm going to select a grid. Now I'm working off the grid customers, so I want to go and grab orders. I don't have to do too much else in there. I can provide a link and, once again, explain link. So it tells you exactly what linking grid components is all about. I mean, really, what's a linking grid? Once you're into it a little bit, it's fine, but when you're new to this stuff, these pop-ups are really, really nice to have. So when you link a grid, the records in the target grid are filtered on the linking fields. So that's fine. There's a lot of information here. What I find, just based on some experience with the Alpha user forum, is that people read some of this stuff, but they don't read all of it. What I tend to do is read all of it a couple of times, because there's just some real gems of information in these things and some really good hints about how to go about doing things as well. So I'll go ahead and I'll link, and I can add fields. So here's a field in my primary. So this is my target grid, the one that I'm opening, and I'm opening it from this component. So I'm linking customer ID field on the primary table of the grid that I'm opening, which is the customer orders grid, and I'm linking it to the customer ID in this particular field. I can click OK. I'm OK. Everything else is good here. You can decide how you want this to pop up. The one thing that I had to wrap my head around with this, as opposed to Access, Access is, I guess, kind of a contained environment, whereas I had to come to think of Alpha as being an HTML JavaScript environment. Now, first, when you're first getting into this stuff, that sounds a little scary, but when you realize the power that that statement gives you, it's amazing, because if we just look at these options for targets, so this is how I want my pop-up window to be displayed. I can show it in a window, which is a modal pop-up, or a modeless pop-up. Or I can show it in a drop-down as well, which is really interesting. And I can set a number, I can set where the window position is, I can set its title and whether I want to show its title or not, and its height and its width, whether I want it to be resizable or not, whether I want it to refresh the grid when it closes. Let's say I made some edit changes on the opening grid. A number of really great options in here. But one of the great things in Alpha is I could open this up in a div, which means that I could specify a div almost anywhere in this grid. There are a number of different places I can put one, and give that div an ID and then specify the ID here, which is just amazing. Or I could have it open in a tabbed UI pane, or if you're dealing with mobile, I could open up in a panel, and then I give it a panel name. So there's amazing power and flexibility here. I'm just going to cancel that out. We'll go and look at the one I've already set up. In this particular case, I'll go pop in here. I did set a filter. I didn't set a link. So really, a lot of times the question is, well, which one do I use? It's okay. There are various reasons for using various things, so various options. So use one that feels comfortable to you or has a better reason for you to use it. A link in this case would have been just fine, but I chose to do a filter just to illustrate that we can do it a number of different ways. And I'm just popping this up, and I'm having it relative to the object that I'm opening it up in. So if I'm clicking on a button, I want it relative to that button, which is really interesting. So you can have it pop up anywhere. In this case, I'm doing relative to the item I'm clicking on. Action JavaScripts. You can stack these up. As I mentioned, there are a number. You can run this synchronously or asynchronously. Asynchronously is by default. Once again, here we go. Great explanation of what this really does mean. And technical notes. As you can see, there's actually a function that's been created called an A5, execute this, then that you can actually call and fill in with particular functions that you want to do. So if you have a number of JavaScript functions, and JavaScript is by nature, notoriously by nature, just runs everything at once. Alpha is built in a way for us to run one thing at a time. And coming from Alpha, coming from Access rather, you know how important that is, because you have to wrap your mind around that as well. In Access and almost everything else, there's program execution, and it just follows the rules. One thing gets done, and the next thing gets done. You can make calls out and come back, but if you were to make a call out of a JavaScript function and not look after it properly, before that function returns, the very next JavaScript statement is going to run. So doing something like this is just brilliant to work with. So I can add a number of different items if I want to. I can put in a fade out message if I want to. Message text. I'm just going to keep all that the same. And comments, of course, to really help keep everything straight. So when I run this JavaScript action, it's going to open up this grid and then run my message. I don't need this in here, so I'm going to remove that. Let's pop back into here. Let's go and talk about code, macros, and actions. So in Alpha and Access, we display logically grouped options, macros and access. Alpha, as you saw, groups the actions according to the component type so that we can see, if I get back in here, and add a new action. All actions, or just AJAX callbacks, or just components, or UX, that sort of thing, which is great. Alpha actions, this is really interesting, can be converted to JavaScript code, which is really interesting. So if I were to do that here, I can view the JavaScript, and most of the time, you're not going to want to do this. Once in a while, it's really nice to see the code that's actually running, because you might actually be able to use it somewhere else as pure JavaScript code. But at least you have the option of having a look at this. And if you need to, you can actually convert it. You'll get a warning. Sure, go ahead. And then I can just cancel that. You can't go back. Cancel out of that. I'm going to show you this in a moment as well. So we'll pop out of this. And we'll go back into our orders. What I'm going to do is show you what I'm talking about with the JavaScript actions and the action JavaScript. What I've got here is a UX component, so we're going to be going through that in a moment, but I want to cover this action JavaScript stuff first while we're talking about it. There was an interesting question on the forum recently about wanting to display Spinless Control but not actually showing it all the time. They wanted to show it because it was taking up a lot of space for them. They wanted to show it and they were actually getting into a field. So in this particular case, when I click here, I get a Spinless Control popping up, which I can move. And as soon as I make a selection of that, the Spinless Control disappears and the value that I chose pops into the field. There are two methods for doing this, and they both look exactly the same. The second method is using show hide expression on the field itself, and this is using action JavaScript to do it. So what I'm going to do is pop out of this. I'm going to reset my controls, and I'm going to close it, and we're going to get out of this and into the UX component where this was taking place. Now this is the status field that I was clicking on. I have an on-focus event running. Now, I use JavaScript actions, really handy when you are working with JavaScript code. So I might have some other JavaScript code here. I want to do an alert first. I want to do some other calculations first, whatever I want to do. But I have to make a choice here whether I want to run in text mode, which is pure JavaScript, or I want to run some JavaScript actions. And that's my choice, those two things. Now, a JavaScript action, I'm just going to pop out of this. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to choose just another event so that we can look at this. I can add a new action. Now, actions can be run as inline JavaScript as well. So it's an amazing amount of flexibility to wrap your head around. And I can do an alert here if I want to. Click OK there. Just as a description. So now I've got some inline JavaScript running as a JavaScript action. I said before you had to make a choice. You don't really have to make a choice. You can do this and then add new actions. You can add a Google Map comment. You can add a grid. You can do whatever else you want here. But if I move into text mode, what I can do here as well is write some code if I want to. So that's great. And then I'm going to do something called action JavaScript, which is the same thing here, but I'm going to create and edit a JavaScript action. I've already got a few set up here. What this means is that I can add a new action. I can call it anything I want. So I'm going to show another grid. So that's my name. I can name it anything I want as long as it's unique. And again, this is all part of alpha pops up, if you're about to get yourself into trouble or forget something, it's going to come back and remind you. You don't have to see this again, but really handy stuff. So here we are, indicates that this code for this action has not yet been defined. So alpha's not holding you by the hand as you're doing this. It'll let you do anything you want, but it's also not going to let you get into trouble. It's looking after you more than holding your hand, which is really good. So I'm going to edit the action for this, and here we are in our familiar add a new action process. I can open a grid component, and again, we're right back into the same process. I'm just going to go ahead and complete this quickly. I'm okay with everything else. I'm okay with that. I'm going to save that. So now I've defined a JavaScript action I described as called show another grid that is running an action JavaScript event. Now you're saying, well, how do I run it? Click to see the JavaScript code to invoke this action. So we're going to be using the run action. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, which is another great feature. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to paste it in, and we're all ready to show another grid. And I can get back in there and edit if I want to. Now I don't have to do a copy, clipboard, all the rest of that stuff. If I remember what I'm doing here, I can insert a method. There are a number of great methods, get parent objects. I can perform a search. So if I want to set a value in my UX control, or if I want to get a value in my UX control, and you'll see here, this information is indispensable for trying to figure out what's going on with alpha, how various methods are being used. Not only is there a description of how it's being used here, but there's always an example, which is amazing because it shows you exactly how this particular method can be used. So in this case, I'm going to close this, and I'm going to type in run. There's my run action. So it tells me that I can run an action that was defined using the action script builder, which is great. I'm going to insert that. And I can pop in my name, and off we go. So a number of different ways to get there. So action JavaScript, creating and scripts that you can create as run actions, as action JavaScripts and JavaScript actions. It's a little bit to wrap your head around, but the first time you see it in use, it'll be great. So in this particular case, I'm running an action called show status. And we'll just get in there and I'll have a quick look at this. So what's my action? I'm going to toggle the display of a container or a div with animation. So in this particular case, now I could show it, hide it, or toggle it. If I choose the toggle visibility, it'll actually figure out whether it's hidden or shown, and it will do the opposite. So if it's shown, it'll hide. If it's hidden, it'll show it. I give it a div. That's a div ID that I created, and I can show you that. And I can tell it how I want the animation done as well. Plus, when the show is complete, I can actually run a JavaScript to do something if I want to. Cancel that. I've defined a number. I'm going to show the status. I'm going to hide the status, and I'm going to toggle the status as well. And I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to save. That's about it for status. Now, I better get into code and calling code. Access, Visual Basic, form and report code is usually private code. Modules can contain functions and subroutines. Of course, module code is usually global. That's available to the database. Great debugger, data types and variables, and just tons of stuff in there. With Alpha X Basic, very similar to VB, you'll feel comfortable in there. There's a ton of built-in functions. So there's a great list and a way to find all that stuff. User-defined XBasic functions. These are things that you can create in the Alpha database code window itself. And if we show that here, this is a code window. And these are global XBasic routines that you can build and that you can actually have. They're not by default included in your publishing when you put your database out onto your server, but you can specify, if I go back up here, you can specify here that any functions that you created in the code window will be compiled into a .aex file and included and published with your system so that any global functions you define will be available, which is great. So that's user-defined functions. They're global. Again, these are not seen by the application server unless you use an option in the publish dialog to get them out there. Grid and UX. XBasic functions, they're local to the component. XBasic events and functions can sometimes return JavaScript code, which is really good. I'll show you that in a moment. And a tremendous debugger as well. I've labeled this alpha JavaScript, but it's just JavaScript, global JavaScript. There's nothing specific that alpha's done to it. It's just pure JavaScript. You can have global JavaScript functions which are placed here. So I've got a function in here that I've defined called hi there, and it's just in a file called myfunction.js. That's all that is. So those are global to the system, as well as you can have local JavaScript functions as well. So if I get into a component, grid customers, I can have events. These are all my events. As XBasic functions and JavaScript functions. And while we're here looking at events, you can see there's a tremendous list. And once again, we click on the information for the event, and it tells us exactly what, when, and what fires, and when it fires, if there's an AJAX callback or not. And an AJAX callback is simply a way to execute an XBasic function on the server from your client. That's pretty much, I think that's it in a nutshell. Events for before search. Can you search before the search is saved? There's just after update record, after you insert, after you delete. Just a tremendous number of functions in there. The same with the UX component. You've got server-side functions, client-side functions. So this happens when everything is rendered and it's all finished and everything's displayed for you, and then you can actually do something that affects the client screen. On panel activate, after login, can you log in? There's timer events, the same as access, same as that sort of thing. And I'm going to come back here now. Syntax checking in JavaScript, which is really nice, very, very handy. Ton of data types, the same as you'd expect in Access. Variables, there are lots of global variables and local variables you can define in Access. In Alpha, you've got this thing called session variables, which is a variable that's alive for the time that you're working with your system. And as soon as you log off, I think in a few minutes, the session variable would go away as well. Plus you have local variables, object and namespaces variables, which means that you can attach a variable to the actual dialog object or grid object, window namespace variables.
Can I actually interrupt you with a few questions? Because
yes, go ahead.
We actually have a lot of questions. And since you had just brought up the notion of the session variable, David, and he asked, in Access, when a user logs in, you can assign a global ID to help filter the data. For example, rsmith is user 123 and account 999, and so that way you can show only the data for account 999, which is allowed for user 123. Is that sort of thing possible with Alpha Anywhere?
Absolutely. Yes. It's all run through this security system. You can assign the value for that particular user if you want to another variable, to a session variable, anything you want. But if we'll get into some code. I can't remember exactly where it is, but there are a great number, like a really large number of functions that you can call to get at the security system. So you can call, get me the current name of the user, get me the current ID of the system, of the person logged in, and you can do that both at an XBasic level and pass that information around and get it into JavaScript level as well. So yes, absolutely.
And that can be used as a filter when they're looking at
yes,
that they only see.
Absolutely, yes.
Excellent. Someone asked sort of just a big overview question, which is how does Alpha sort of different than like the Office 365 Access web application thing that you can now get?
I don't really know. I had a quick look at that, but I didn't look at it that much because I wasn't happy with what it did. I got the impression that Access on the web wasn't that functional in its form that they pushed it out in. Alpha is like Access to the power of 10, but working at your desktop, you've got an amazing number of events. It's like you're working in Access, but all of a sudden you publish all this stuff up to your server, and you've got it running in web pages and mobile devices. And I don't know if Office 365 does mobile, Do you know if it does, Dave?
No, I don't believe it does. Donna, there are some other people here who have also familiarity with the new Office 365, and we can definitely get you an answer to that question. We have your email address, but we could also tackle your other question, though, which is, can you create an application that runs both on the desktop as well as on web and mobile environments, or do you have to keep them as separate applications?
You don't have to keep them as separate applications, not at all. I don't have anything to show you that, but what I'll do is look at a quick mobile app that I put together. What we're dealing with here is panels. I'll just run this and I'll demonstrate what I mean by panels. So here we've got an iPhone simulator come up, and this can be shown in horizontal or iPad vertical or horizontal. And you'll notice as I do this, everything changes and fills up the screen. I don't have to tell it. All I told it was I want a couple of fields on there. That's all I want. So in this particular case, this is a panel that I'm running in. Panels contain data. Now this is also wrapped in something called a panel navigator. It allows me to navigate from panel to panel. There's also a panel layout. So I can do this. Now, there's nothing in there, but I can then do this. If I click on an item, then I'll get that item filtered based on customer ID. Now if I come back here, we've got a panel navigator. I've got 2 panel cards running in here. And what Alpha, in order to answer your question, what Alpha also has, it's a container called a Flex Layout Container. Now a Flex Layout Container, so I'll just pop this back, I'll just pop this in here. A Flex Layout Container allows you to define how you want this to run, whether you're on an iPhone or a pure web browser, or an Android device, and if it's an Android device, which Android device is it? And am I running on an iPad? Am I running horizontal or vertical? That's what this Flex Layout does for you. So we're able to produce one application that allows you to modify itself depending on what you are doing. And there's a great number of videos that Selwyn Alpha has put out to explain all that really, really well.
We actually have quite a bit more information coming out soon on our blog, and probably also in webinars dealing with what we call responsive design, which means that it figures out what device you're running on. Is it a phone? Is it a tablet? Is it a full-size desktop? And then produces a interface that makes the most sense for what you're looking at. Responsive design also handles things like, okay, this might be on a full desktop screen, but what if the person has squeezed the window down to 50%? You know, where are the fields going to go? Are they going to disappear off the screen, or are they going to intelligently move down or move up or move to the side or things like that? And we'll be talking about that as well. Just to ask you another question here, this had to do with the search fields. This was sort of earlier on, and Armand asked, regarding the search fields, is it possible to do an incremental search? So after you get some records, can you go and sort of further filter them?
Yes, absolutely. There's an option in there to either clear the search, if you've got a number of different search fields, to either clear the initial search or to leave it in place and do an incremental search.
Great. We also have a question here about whether or not you can connect to MySQL or Microsoft SQL Express. And
yes.
The answer to that is you can. We also support, there are drivers that come right out of the box with that. We also support DB2, we support Oracle, and there's actually quite a long list
Access.
of options. There's, and Access is
absolutely.
A example. In fact, you can leave your desktop version of your application going and have your web application access the very same access file. I know I just said access twice, that's sort of confusing, but have it access the same MDB file so that you have your old legacy application running, fine, as it's always run, and then you can extend that by creating an Alpha Anywhere application that uses that exact same data source. So there's no updating or importing or anything like that, but the same data source. Here, you're going ahead and connecting. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm just going to create this. So this is my MDB file. So I'll just pull up customers once again. My fields, I want that number of fields. I'll pop those in, and that's it. I'm just going to run it. So that's connected to my MDB table now.
Right, so nothing needed to be imported. You just pointed directly to the MDB file. So any updates that you made here would be reflected if you went back into Access and looked at it there as well.
Yep. As long as you have a named connection going, everything's possible.
Mm-hmm. Another person asked, and this probably has to do with mobile if I had to guess, do you have to be connected to the net all the time? And I'm going to go ahead and field that one also. Yep. And the answer is currently you do. We're not going to be able to save data or browse through records or anything like that, but that is changing very soon. We are working on disconnected versions of your applications so that a lot of it will run inside the client and updates will be made only when connectivity is put together again. Again, look for that information on that in blog and in upcoming webinars.
Yeah.
Is there any support for SQL stored procedures? Let me take that one as well, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, SQL stored procedures are actually written at the SQL end. So if you're using SQL Server and you want to set up trigger events or store procedures or anything like that, you can go ahead and use those, and Alpha Anywhere will be completely compatible with them. So that's not an issue. Oh, someone has asked about multi-user and record locking. How is that handled? So in other words, if somebody is editing a record and someone else comes along and tries to edit that same record, what happens? I'll let you answer that one.
Okay. Well, it's SQL Server, so SQL Server is looking after stuff.
Okay.
So...
Right, and we also have, I think, let's take a look.
So it's fine.
Here's someone who wanted to show an example about the status spin control I think you were talking about earlier.
Oh, yes.
And could you just show that and show the div that contains that so we can kind of look at the page, see a real example.
So I've got two spinless controls on here because I was showing them and hiding them in different ways. So here's a really interesting thing about Alpha. This spinless control, I've defined it as having static data. Now the data for the spinless control can be a data series, which means you can run a SQL statement against a table and bring in information that will fill up the spinless control. In this particular case, I said I'm running static data. So you can save your lists, manage your lists, have predefined lists if you want. I think there's some really good stuff in here as well. So that's my list, but I've set it as being hidden because I want to do something else with it. So here I've said hide the list, or hide this control. And here I've put in a freeform container. Is it other controls or data controls? Container, sorry. It's a freeform layout. So I put in a freeform layout. Freeform layout is pure HTML, so you can do anything you want here. So because the control's been hidden, Alpha knows that if I'm going to be using a freeform edit control, then I can have my spinless control back if I want to. So what I've done here is I've just set up a very simple HTML statement, div ID equals status field, and I popped in my spinless control. I can just do that. I'm just going to do that. So you just double click on it and it pops in. So now because it's hidden, I get access to it in a freeform container. I set the div, and then as you remember in the onFocus event, I showed this div. Now when the system first started up, it's freeform container. I think I have a client-side event in here. It says when everything's rendered, when everything's complete, hide my status spinless control. So everything's finished, I hide it. And then I can go ahead and show it and toggle it back and forth if I want to. Does that answer the question?
I believe that does, and the control is here or hidden. There it is. Great.
I've got a button here to hide it. And I've got an action on the button so that when I choose something, the action says hide it, but first fill this in. Those are all actions.
Great. So anyway, we are running out of time right now, and we have quite a few questions still left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download this questions log and try to get them answered for you afterwards. We also are going to be doing another webinar next week, and we're calling this a flash webinar. It's going to be with Selwyn Ravens. It's going to be, I think, Wednesday, but you're going to get an actual official email about it pretty soon. And he's going to be covering basically sort of impromptu topics. So if you guys have questions that are specific to something you'd like to see covered, you know, like how do I do this little thing, or even, you know, conceptually, what does this mean? You know, send in those questions as well. You can send them to me here, either at dave@alphasoftware.com. You can also send them to guides@alphasoftware.com, GUIDES, and then I'll know what the subject is that you're looking for help Anyway, that's it. I apologize that we couldn't get to the end of everything, but time really does go really fast. So that sort of concludes today's webinar. Again, we will look at getting you the questions, and in a day or so, we're going to send you an email with a link to the recording, should you download it. We'll also give you information about the upcoming webinars there as well. Now, if you're not an Alpha 5 subscriber, or if you've let your subscription lapse and would like to get information on pricing, please send an email to sales@alphasoftware.com. From Alpha Software, I'm Dave McCormick. Thanks again for attending. We look forward to seeing you in future webinars, and thank you very much, David Cates. Have a nice day.